Alrighty, so I'm Max.
And I'm Amanda. Today we are speaking with Ian Haley. He has a degree in political science and is here to answer some of our questions on voter suppression. How are you today, Ian?
Doing well, guys. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming.
So what is voter suppression? Like, why should we care about it?
Yeah, so voter suppression is essentially when whether a state or non-state actor is attempting to prevent some group's right to vote, right? So in the U.S., we have this kind of principle that we have a democracy that's built on free and fair elections, and when groups or governments try to undermine that, we have an obligation to push back against it. I guess that gives you a start to that conversation. Yeah.
And so how has voter suppression affected past elections, like before 1960?
Right. So before we had the Voting Rights Act, and yeah, I guess we'll go back there. So I guess before 1960, there's a few things you could talk about. For one, there was a whole period in which we were even enfranchising groups that had no right to vote, right, in our country. Like we had the 15th Amendment that provided black men the right to vote. You had the 19th Amendment that provided women the right to vote. So for one, there's even just the topic of, enfranchising people, giving them the right to vote. But once you kind of had this large-scale right to vote, with the exceptions like felons, people in prison, things like that, you had more subversive attempts to prevent people to access the vote, like gerrymandering is a very typical one that you would hear about, especially in southern states. You had an issue where basically population centers of people of color were being intentionally carved up through a process called gerrymandering, where you were cornering smaller segments of a larger population into a voting district where they went from being a majority of the population to a minority of the population. And that was kind of built on this assumption that people of color were going to vote differently from white voters in a way that would not benefit the existing government structure in those states.
Isn't it illegal to gerrymander based on race today?
So gerrymandering based on race is in itself illegal, yes. You cannot do that.
Sure.
Discriminatory practices against people of color for a reason that they are people of color is unconstitutional. You cannot do it. However, they find tricky, clever ways to get around it. They'll take some other kind of justification, things like that. Then you get into you get a little bit, you can kind of draw parallels to what we have going on in our modern political ecosystem, yeah.
Interesting. So the Voting Rights Act in 1965, that made it so that some counties couldn't, it was trying to stop some counties from discriminating, right?
Correct.
But didn't the Supreme Court overturn that? Was it somehow unconstitutional?
So when we look at the Shelby County case, so the premise of what the federal government was trying to do itself was not what the Supreme Court necessarily took issue with. It's not that it was unconstitutional to try to prevent discrimination in these voting districts. Instead, what the Supreme Court took issue was a section called 4B, which determined where this standard could be applied. Because the federal government didn't say, look, we're going to apply this standard across the entire United States. Every district has to submit any changes they want to make for pre-clearance from the federal government. Instead, they said, we're going to focus on specific areas where this has essentially been an issue, right? And they used different factors like the turnout, the voting turnout, the representation of minorities in those districts to determine that. And what happened in Shelby County is they said, Shelby County, Alabama, they said, look, the federal government has been holding this standard of preclearance against us based on data from the 1960s. It's 2013. Our data has changed. The outcomes have changed. There's now people of color in office. There's now higher turnout amongst people of color in our county. So the determination obviously is not linked to our present reality, and that argument seemed to fare well with the Supreme Court in 2013. And basically what they did was they struck the part of the 4B that said how the federal government can determine which districts are subject to preclearance. And they said, if Congress can find another way to determine that, that's fine. You can still have a preclearance doctrine, but it cannot be determined based on voting data from the 1960s.
Interesting. So have things changed in Shelby County today from when that change was issued? Is Shelby County still working in a way that there are people of color in power, or did getting rid of the preclearance issue actually cause more issues?
Well, certainly I think having no credible way for the federal government, well, I guess it's not that there's no credible way, it's more that by sending this issue back to Congress, the Supreme Court basically understood, like, we're putting Congress in a position to redetermine this, and it's not the priority of our Congress to redetermine this. So it's something like, basically the Supreme Court understands, like, if we do this, they're not going to get around to this unless there is this large popular movement to determine this. But it's such a like bureaucratic issue, how to determine which localities, that, like, unless you get a really focused group of activists on this to make this issue popular, it's probably not going to be before Congress again. So in that same way, like, the Supreme Court does that all the time, where they're like, oh, we'll just send this back to Congress, and if the people care, they'll do something about it. And typically those are issues that don't have a lot of popular momentum. As to the specifics of how things are going in Shelby County today, I don't know so much. I haven't checked in with them in a while. But, yeah.
So what does today's voter suppression look like? I feel like we don't have poll exams and taxes anymore, correct?
Well, I mean, poll exams and taxes. Get into that a little bit for me, because
Well, I know that way back in the day, we used to make people take a test, like a language proficiency test, or we would make them pay a poll tax. And that was a way of stopping people in minority communities from participating in elections, because they weren't part of the general population that
Right.
knew these things, spoke that language, had the means.
Yeah. Okay, I understand now.
But that's
yeah.
illegal, right?
Right.
Sure.
So we don't have poll exams now, and that's I think we can all celebrate that. Yeah, there was a very, like, white supremacist elitist argument that was saying, like, look, if you have to take this exam because, basically by means of your race, we're going to assume you're not as capable to vote. Fortunately, we don't have things like that anymore. Voter suppression today takes a whole new shape. I feel like, in a way, it's and this can be a good thing, is that it's more ubiquitous in how it affects people. So now you have means of voter suppression that are intended to harm all of us, regardless of race and sex. Obviously, there are still targeted efforts with regards to race, sex, and sexual orientation. But if you look at what's going on, especially with attempts within the Trump administration to apply voter suppression, they affect all of us, and it's an important issue for everybody. We all have a responsibility to push back against it. Today, how it manifests, there's a lot of attempts to find ways not to count votes that have been cast. Like, the Trump administration is very intent on delegitimizing the effect of early voting and mail-in voting, which those do disproportionately affect people of color because they disproportionately affect urban areas. Generally, urban areas are more prone to mail-in and early voting because life is more busy in urban areas. It's harder to find the time to find the polling place, to have the infrastructure to do that. And so a lot of those communities opt for early and mail-in voting. And we've seen a distinct effort by the Trump administration.
I think that also
to
applies to
delegitimize
people with disabilities as well. Like, they can't get out and vote.
Absolutely.
So they're
People with an economic disprivilege also.
Right.
If you're working a lot or even full-time, it's sometimes hard to get to the polling place at the correct time.
Absolutely, yeah.
So last time I went to vote, I saw some people leaving the line, and I was really confused because if you've already made the effort to choose who you're going to vote for, you got to the polling place at the right time, why at that point would you bother to just leave?
Sure. Yeah, so why would you bother to leave at that stage? There's a few things. Sometimes, and what we have seen lately is that there are quite a few efforts to basically make people afraid to show up and cast their vote. You know, like if you're in line, you're starting to see how the procedure goes. You're seeing that you have to interact with government officials just to get your ballot, things like that. Let's say maybe if you are somebody who feels like their vote is at odds with the intentions of the government, you might have maybe a little bit of extra hesitancy. This is something that could be really important for our next midterm election. You know, like there has been a lot of conversation. So Donald Trump, for instance, issued an order to the Department of Justice to facilitate election monitors for like widespread for the 2026 midterms. And that's not an unusual practice. The Department of Justice has in the past provided election monitoring services, but there is
That would be a police presence?
There is a fear that it's going to present itself through very not necessarily police, maybe it's police, but there is a concern that you'll have things like ICE agents outside of polling places.
right.
And,
Yep.
you know, generally speaking, like undocumented citizens don't have a right to participate in our elections, but ICE has not shown that they are carrying out a proper, examination of a person's right, immigrant status.
Yeah.
Their whether basically they're dragging away citizens, and then they're saying like, "Whoops, sorry."
Sure, and then you can't cast your vote anyway because the polling place closed while
Right.
you were in custody.
Yeah, and on that issue as well is like if you believe that there has been a compromise within the Department of Justice and its integrity, then you might be concerned that these people who are put in place to monitor the election may also be in place simply just to, have fraudulent votes cast, to take the ballot boxes, things like that. So there's a lot to watch with regards to voter suppression with the upcoming election. The last one seemed to have gone off without much of a hitch. So, hoping that trend continues into 2026.
Sure.
So we talked about like mail-in ballots and stuff like that. So like for someone like me, I'm a single mother who works full-time and school full-time. It's difficult for me to get out and vote. It's even difficult for me to really put the time and energy into deciding who to vote for. I'm fortunate to live in a community who typically votes in my best interests. I just feel I really feel for the people who are in the same position as me, who do not live in communities that care about them and their place in society. I try to look at the big picture here as far as like what everybody else is going through. Like I said, there's a lot of people out there like me, and like you were saying this before too, like when we were talking about the mail-in voting, it's like urban areas are faster paced. Everybody's super busy, so it's hard for them to really get out and or pay attention to what is even going on in the communities around us to vote in our best interest. Yeah. So what can we do about this? Like I know like spreading awareness and whatnot, like those are probably our best bet, but like how can we help these people who don't have the education and ability to really get out there to vote?
Well, especially because it feels like the people who have the ability to affect that change are the ones benefiting from the restrictions. So how do you get past that inherent issue?
Yeah, that's the mountain to climb. As far as getting past it, one thing that we've talked about that has shown a disproportionate ability to affect people in busy life situations who do have disabilities, right, is to protect those measures that provide people the right to vote early and to vote by mail. When you have early voting available, that has moved election days to one day. It's into a couple weeks. So now you have, you can decide, like, if it is your priority to get out and vote, if you have a vested interest in this election, you now have a time frame in which you can kind of look at your calendar, say, I have a little bit more free time on this day. I will find the time on that day to go vote. If early voting is totally disregarded as like at risk for fraud, then that ability goes away, and that makes it ever harder
Right.
to vote in that situation.
Well, it's bad enough. I mean, mail-in ballots are already kind of a difficult process as it is. Like, you have to take the time to even really do all that.
Yeah.
It's true. So I've voted by mail in the past. Having it mailed to your house, it shows up in your mailbox. You take the ballot out, fill it out, stick it back in the mailbox. The more challenging part of that is knowing exactly what procedures to go through in order to even facilitate that
To
coming to
acquire
your
the
house.
ballot in the
Right.
first place.
Right.
And a lot of that comes down to, like, basically, I mean, in some sense, we need people to market this stuff. You know?
Right.
Yeah.
We need people to market, the security of voting by mail. That it's not like this, because there is this attempt to basically paint voting by mail as like, oh, well, now that you can vote by mail, there's this separation of the polling staff from the voter. And so if you're voting from in your home, there's like a higher potential for fraud is the argument you're hearing. And so pushing back against that argument, because it doesn't change the fact of how your vote is counted. If the information on your ballot doesn't line up with documented records of your citizenship and things like that, that vote's not counted. So it's important that we have an effort out there to appropriately market this so that people take advantage of it, and to protect it from efforts that would do away with it.
Well, I am very grateful for you, Ian, for coming and doing this with us today. I've learned so much this whole time. I don't know a ton about this, and I feel badly that I don't, because I feel like I should. I think everybody should, but it's hard because, like I said, I'm full-time madness all of the time. So so for me to hear, from you guys, who you're both much younger than me, and a lot more about this than me, it does give me hope in the future for our country and communities and stuff like that. So, Ian, I am really grateful for you coming and doing this today.
Of course, we appreciate
Genuinely.
you saying so.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no shortage of, or there's a shortage of hope out there. So having people who are hopeful, it's always valuable.
Yes,
too.
yeah. I'm so grateful.
I have a personal level interest in the topic, so I've done a lot of research myself, and I still really appreciate hearing from a more learned perspective, because it helps me to get a bigger picture. So I really appreciate you coming down.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. Thanks, guys.
All right, so this concludes our project for the day. Have a great day.